The Galactic Accord had 1,700 member species, 1,700 civilizations, each with their own starships, their own weapons, their own very long and very complicated history of declaring war on each other and then later shaking hands about it. They had survived extinction events, supernova shockwaves, dimensional tears, and one particularly catastrophic diplomatic misunderstanding involving the Vorkai and a plate of salted fish. They had never, not once, called the humans, until today. Commander Zyrel Os stood at the center of the Accord's emergency war chamber, her 6 translucent eyes scanning the tactical display that stretched across 3 walls. The display was red. All of it. Not the soft, polite red of an Amber Alert. The kind of red that meant everything was already on fire and the fire was winning. "Status report," she said, because someone had to say something and the rest of the room seemed to have temporarily stopped functioning. General Dovak of the Theron Collective cleared his enormous throat. He was one of those species that communicated partly through vibration and partly through glands, and right now he was vibrating at a frequency that translated roughly to, "We are absolutely doomed, but I am trying very hard to look calm about it. The Keth swarm has breached the outer Rin sector, Commander. 3 battle stations destroyed. The 4th is venting atmosphere. Admiral Serene is requesting permission to begin staged withdrawal." Zyrel stared at the map. The Keth were not an army. They were not even technically a civilization. They were a consuming force, a biological machine the size of a moon that moved through space like a hurricane moves through a city, and they had just eaten through the most heavily fortified defensive line in the Eastern Quadrant in approximately 4 standard days. 4 days. It had taken the Accord 11 years to build that line. "Where is Fleet Group 7? She asked. "Destroyed, Commander." "Fleet Group 12? Retreating. Estimated 20% combat effectiveness remaining." "The Orenvian artillery platforms?" There was a pause. Dovak shifted his considerable weight. "The Keth ate them, Commander." "Of course they did." Zyrel turned to face the room. Around the curved table sat the senior representatives of 14 major species, all of them looking at her with the same expression, which was the galactic standard expression for "please tell us you have a plan," mixed with a secondary expression of "we can already tell you do not have a plan." She did not have a plan. She had something worse. She had a suggestion. "Contact the Terran sovereignty," she said. The room did not explode, but it came close. Several representatives spoke at once, in several different languages, and while the translation matrix struggled gamely to keep up, the general consensus was very clear: absolutely not. Under any circumstances, not a chance. Are you serious? Please reconsider. "They are not members of the Accord," said Ambassador Previn of the Alessi, his color patches flashing an agitated orange. "They are not bound by our conventions. They do not follow our rules of engagement. Their military philosophy is, and I want to be precise here, completely unhinged." "Their military philosophy works," Zyrel said. "They fought a war using biological disease vectors on their own planet," Previn said, "against themselves. They did this for 47 years. That was a long time ago. They have a military award for soldiers who complete missions despite sustaining wounds that would kill most species before the mission even started. They call it the Purple Heart. It is an award for getting hurt and continuing anyway. What species gives awards for that?" "The kind that wins," Zyrel said. More silence. Different kind of silence now. The uncomfortable kind, where everyone in the room knew she was right, but none of them wanted to be the one to admit it. The Keth swarm on the tactical display continued to move. It did not care about this meeting. It did not care about anything. That was honestly the entire problem. Dovak's vibration changed register. "Commander, even if we contact the Terrans, what makes you believe they will respond? They have no treaty obligation, no membership, no stake in the Outer Rim at this time." "They have humans in those systems," Zyrel said. "Colonists. Traders, scattered settlements throughout the Rin sector, roughly 4 million of them." The room went very quiet. "Oh," said Dovak. "Yes," said Zyrel. "Oh." Because here was the thing about humans that every species in the Accord knew, the thing they whispered about at diplomatic functions and wrote papers about in hushed academic tones. Humans did not abandon their own. It was not a policy. It was not a doctrine. It was something closer to a genetic defect. A hard-coded absolute that overrode every rational cost-benefit calculation a species was supposed to be able to run. You threatened 4 million humans and you got the entirety of the Terran military within the same time it took for the message to arrive and the very brief period afterward for them to stop being surprised and start being angry. Zyrel pressed the broadcast key herself. "This is Commander Zyrel Os of the Galactic Accord Emergency Command, transmitting on all human-monitored frequencies. We are requesting immediate military assistance under the Outer Rim Crisis Provision, Keth Swarm Incursion, 4 million Terran nationals currently within the affected zone, coordinates to follow. She released the key. Someone at the far end of the table said quietly, "How long until they respond?" Zyril checked the distance, calculated the signal delay, added a margin for humans doing whatever it was humans did when they got mad, which apparently was not very long at all. 11 hours, she said. They received a response in 9. The response was from someone called Admiral Petra Voss of the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and it read in its entirety, "Received and confirmed, we are already moving, have coffee ready, we will explain when we arrive." Nobody knew what coffee was. The translation matrix rendered it as a ritual stimulant consumed in preparation for conflict, and that was in fact exactly what it was. Admiral Voss arrived in 7 hours instead of the promised 11, which was the first indication that something unusual was happening. The second indication was the size of her fleet. The third indication was that her fleet had arrived not from the direction of Terran space but from 3 different directions simultaneously, having apparently split into independent task forces at some point during the 9 hours since receiving the distress call. Zyril met her in the command bay. Petra Voss was a compact human woman with close-cropped gray hair, a scar running from her left ear to her jaw that she had clearly never bothered to remove with the medical technology that could have done so in about 40 minutes, and the particular expression of someone who had received bad news, processed it completely, and was now entirely focused on what to do about it. She looked at the tactical display for approximately 12 seconds. "Okay," she said. "So the good news is we've seen something like this before." Zyril felt something she had not felt in 3 days, a small, tentative flicker of hope. "You have?" "No," Voss said. "I was being optimistic. We haven't seen anything exactly like this, but we've made a study of consuming-type organisms and we have a working theory." "What is the theory?" Voss turned from the display. Her eyes were the particular shade of blue-gray that Zyril's species would have called storm water, and there was something in them that was simultaneously completely calm and extremely dangerous, the way very deep oceans were calm on the surface and terrifying underneath. "The Keth aren't smart," Voss said. "They're efficient. There's a difference. Efficiency can be beaten. You just have to be willing to be inefficient about it." "I don't know what that means." "It means," Voss said, and she was already pulling up her own tactical overlay, already placing things on the map with the casual certainty of someone who had spent the last 9 hours thinking about exactly this, that the Keth go toward the most food, always. That's their whole decision-making process, maximum consumption, minimum resistance, so you stop trying to be a wall and start being a door, and then you choose where the door leads. Ambassador Priven appeared at Zyril's shoulder, patches still flashing orange. "You're talking about a lure," he said. "You want to bait the swarm." "I want to bait the swarm into a location of our choosing," Voss corrected, "using organic material dense enough to redirect its primary consumption vector, at which point we execute a coordinated collapse of 3 specific structural nodes that our preliminary analysis suggests are load-bearing for the swarm's collective navigation system." Silence again. "You've been analyzing the swarm's structure?" Zyril asked. "For how long?" "Since the signal arrived," Voss said. 9 hours. We had good sensor data from your destroyed stations. Your people died getting that data, Commander. I intend to make that worth something." Zyril looked at this small, gray-haired, scar-faced human standing in the center of an alien command room, speaking with the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Voss smiled. It was a very particular kind of smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes not because of coldness but because the eyes are already somewhere else, already 3 steps ahead, already running the calculations for what came next. "I need your slowest, most expendable ships," she said, "and I need them to look absolutely terrified." Previn's patches shifted to a deeply unhappy purple. "Why terrified?" "Because," Voss said, pulling on a set of tactical gloves and beginning to manipulate the display with both hands, "the Keth follow panic. It's the signature of fleeing prey. You want to be convincing, you need ships that actually know their bait. Scared ships move like scared ships, the Keth can tell the difference." "And your ships?" Zyril asked. "Where will they be?" Voss pointed to 3 locations on the display, 3 spots that were currently empty of any tactical significance, positioned in a pattern that made no sense until you understood what was happening at the center of it. "Waiting," she said simply. She said it the way humans apparently said everything, Zyril would later reflect, with the absolute, unreasonable, completely irrational confidence of a species that had been in worse situations than this, had survived them all, and had somewhere along the way stopped being surprised by the surviving. The battle had been lost, until it wasn't, but that part of the story comes next. The bait ships were volunteered. That was the part that nobody outside the Accord ever quite believed when the story got told afterward, which it did, endlessly, at every diplomatic gathering and military academy and quiet bar in 17 star systems. The crews volunteered. 43 ships, mostly Wylesi light cruisers, and a handful of Theron cargo haulers repurposed with whatever extra shielding the engineers could bolt on in 4 hours, and every single crew had been given the choice to step off before launch. Not one of them did. Zyril watched them go from the command bay window, those 43 small ships burning toward the Keth swarm in loose, deliberately ragged formation, and she felt something she could not immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it because it was not an emotion she had experienced recently. It was pride. "They know what they're flying into," she said, not really to anyone. Admiral Voss was standing beside her, hands clasped behind her back, watching the same window. "Yes," she said, "and they went anyway." "Yes. Does that not disturb you?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "It would disturb me more if they hadn't been given the choice," she said. "Bravery without choice is just bad luck. Bravery with choice is something else." She said it simply, without drama, the way someone states an obvious fact they have carried for a long time. Zyril filed it away. She suspected she would be thinking about it for years. On the tactical display, the Keth swarm moved. It was, up close on sensors, even more enormous than the map suggested. A biological mass the approximate diameter of a mid-sized moon, moving through space with the patient, grinding momentum of something that had never once in its entire existence been stopped. It left nothing behind it. Not debris, not wreckage, just empty space where things had previously existed. The 43 bait ships flickered at its leading edge like sparks near a storm. "It's tracking them," said Lieutenant Heron, Voss's tactical officer. A young human with nervous hands and extremely fast eyes. He was the kind of person who looked like he should be studying something in a library and had instead ended up doing this, which was a pattern Zyril had noticed about human military personnel generally. "Consumption vectors are shifting, 17 degrees north ecliptic, it's following." "Good," Voss said. She did not sound relieved. She sounded like someone who had expected this to happen and was simply confirming the expected result. "Navarro, how are the task forces positioned?" A voice came back through the comm, calm, clipped, unhurried. "Task Force Kilo is holding at Node 1. Pharaoh Squadron is 10 minutes from Node 2. Colonel Downtier confirms Node 3 is locked and ready. Tell Downtier to hold until my mark and not 1 second before." "Understood, Admiral." Voss turned to Zyril. "You should probably tell your people what's about to happen. They're going to see things that might be alarming if they don't have context." "What kinds of things?" "The unpleasant kind," Voss said entirely without embarrassment. "We found the swarm's 3 structural anchor nodes. They're internal, deep. Getting to them means cutting into the swarm body itself." Zyril processed this. "You are going to send ships inside the Keth swarm?" "Yes." "That is not a mission, that is an execution." "It's a mission," Voss said. And now the calm in her eyes had a different texture to it, something underneath the surface that was not coldness and was not recklessness but was the third thing, the thing that had no clean name in most languages. "Our ships have ablative shielding rated for biological acid exposure, rotating barrier frequencies to counter the swarm's electromagnetic suppression, and the crews inside are wearing suits that can sustain them for up to 6 hours if the ship goes dark. And if the ship goes dark for longer than 6 hours, then they did something that mattered," Voss said quietly, "and we will remember them for it." Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. It was General Dovak who finally broke the silence, vibrating at a low, complicated frequency. "Your species," he said slowly, "is deeply, profoundly strange." "We know," said Voss. "It works out, though, usually." The bait ships had drawn the swarm 14 degrees off its original heading, which put it exactly where the 3 task forces needed it. Heron was calling out increments with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this before, or someone who had trained so thoroughly for this that the difference was impossible to detect. "Contact in 8 minutes. Node 1 entry window is opening. Pharaoh Squadron is in position. All ships, this is Voss. You have your assignments. You know what we need. Execute when ready, not when comfortable. Comfortable is for afterward." A wave of acknowledgments came back through the comm, dozens of voices, human voices, and Zyril noticed something about them. They were not afraid, or if they were, the fear had been compressed into something that functioned like focus, the way extreme pressure turns soft material into something that can cut. She had read about this. She had not believed it, not really, not until she heard it in the voices of 43 bait ship crews flying towards something that had eaten 3 battle stations in 4 days. "Contact," Heron said. The swarm reached the bait ships. This was the part that was hard to watch. Zyrel watched anyway because the people on those ships were watching it too, and she owed them at least that much. The swarm's leading edge engulfed the first 3 ships like water swallowing stones. There was no explosion, no dramatic last-second escape. One moment the ships were on the display, and the next moment they were not. But here was the thing. Here was the thing that Voss had calculated and every Accord commander had assumed was impossible. The bait ships did not all die at once, because Voss had told them not to run in a line. She had told them to spiral, to fracture, to scatter in 7 different directions while maintaining a general movement toward a central point, because the swarm processed consuming multiple simultaneous targets the same way any mass predator processes too many prey moving in too many directions at once. It spread itself thin, it reached, and when something enormous reaches in too many directions simultaneously, the center becomes less dense. That was the window. "Node 1 team go," Voss said. From the eastern approach, a group of 12 Terran strike ships burned hard and fast toward the swarm's northern face, moving not away from it but directly into it, through the gap the bait formation had created at the biological equivalent of the swarm's left shoulder. They hit the outer membrane, and the sensors screamed warnings that Heron silenced with a single practiced keystroke. "They're inside," he said. "Node 2. Pharaoh Squadron hit from below. 8 ships, smaller and faster, drilling through the swarm's ventral surface using a rotating drill formation that Zyrel had never seen before and later learned humans had invented during a different conflict against a different consuming organism on a different planet 40 years ago, because apparently this was not even the strangest thing Terran forces had ever been asked to do. They breached. They went in. "Node 3 on your mark, Admiral," came Dantier's voice. On the display the swarm had noticed, or what passed for noticing, in something that had no central brain and no language and no thought in any recognizable sense. Its outer membrane was contracting, pulling inward, the biological equivalent of a fist closing, and anything inside that fist when it finished closing was not going to be recoverable. "Mark," Voss said. Dantier's team hit Node 3 from above and they did not drill. They detonated a shaped charge against the swarm's dorsal surface that Heron, watching sensors, described afterward as the most unreasonable thing I have ever seen function correctly, blowing a breach large enough for 3 ships abreast to fly through in formation, which is exactly what they did. 3 teams, 3 nodes, all inside the swarm simultaneously. "Now we wait," Voss said. "For what?" Zyrel asked. "For them to do the job." The job, as it turned out, took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the tactical display showed the swarm beginning its membrane contraction and then slowing it, and then in what the sensors rendered as a massive biological shudder visible across 4 different frequency bands, stopping it entirely. A tremor moved through the swarm from its northern face to its southern trailing edge, a wave of disruption traveling through billions of tons of interconnected biological material. Then another wave, in the opposite direction. Then silence. The swarm stopped moving, not slowed, not turned, stopped. The way a machine stops when you remove the part it was built around. The collective navigation nodes, all 3 of them compromised within a 40-second window of each other, had done something that no weapon in the Accord's arsenal had managed in 6 weeks of fighting. They had interrupted whatever process allowed this enormous, ancient, consuming thing to decide where to go next. It was not dead. Voss was extremely clear about this. "It is not dead," she said to the room, to the representatives who were beginning to make sounds that in several species indicated premature celebration. "It is disoriented. We have minutes, maybe less, before it begins rerouting its navigation process through secondary systems. We need to begin the collapse sequence now, and we need every ship you have, Accord and Terran both, hitting the designated coordinates simultaneously." She said every ship you have, and she meant it. Which Zyrel understood meant the command ships too, the flagships, the vessels carrying the admirals and the generals and the ambassadors and herself. "You're including us," Zyrel said. "Every ship," Voss repeated. "I need the mass. I need the volume of fire. It works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, being in a flagship versus a cruiser doesn't change the outcome anyway." This was objectively a completely reasonable statement that also happened to be absolutely terrifying. Zyrel gave the order. What happened next took 4 minutes and has been reconstructed from sensor data, survivor accounts, and one remarkably clear recording made by a Theran signals officer who had the presence of mind to keep her equipment running through all of it. Approximately 900 ships, Terran and Accord combined, converged on the disoriented Keth swarm from 7 vectors simultaneously and fired everything they had at a pattern of coordinates that Heron had calculated in the previous 40 minutes and that looked, on the display, less like a tactical plan and more like a geometric artwork. The swarm convulsed. It was the only word for it. The biological mass shuddered and contracted and then did the thing that nothing this large had ever done in the recorded history of the galaxy. It began to come apart. Not explode, come apart. The internal cohesion failed, the membrane integrity collapsed, the consuming force that had eaten 3 battle stations and a defensive line 11 years in the making broke into sections, and the sections stopped moving and the moving stopped, and then the battle was over. Afterward, Zyrel found Voss standing alone at the command bay window, holding a metal cup of something dark and bitter-smelling that the translation matrix still insisted on calling ritual conflict stimulant, looking out at what the display showed, which was a lot of debris and a very great deal of empty space that had 20 minutes ago been occupied by something considerably less empty. "You knew it would work," Zyrel said. "I thought it would work," Voss said. "There's a difference." "You seemed very certain." "Certainty is a performance," Voss said without any embarrassment about the admission. "You perform certainty because the people around you need something to anchor to. If I stand in front of 43 volunteer crews and say, 'I think this might work, I'm not sure, fingers crossed,' they die for a maybe. You give them certainty, they die for a fact, and sometimes, because they die for a fact, nobody has to die at all." She was looking out the window at the debris field, and her expression was the complicated one, the one that Zyrel was starting to recognize as the expression humans wore when the math came out in their favor and they were deeply, privately glad, and also grieving the parts of the equation that had not survived. "The bait crews," Zyrel said. 31 of 43 ships made it out of the membrane contraction window, Voss said. 12 were consumed before the disruption completed. We're tracking life pod signals from 4 of those 12. Rescue teams are already en route. "And your internal teams, the node strike crews?" Voss took a long, slow breath. "Node 1 team, 10 of 12 ships confirmed out. Node 2, 5 of 8, 2 more under tow, 1 unaccounted. Node 3, all 3 ships out." She paused. "Colonel Dantier blew a hole big enough to fly back through. Said he wasn't leaving without everyone." Zyrel looked at her. "He made a larger exit breach than you planned for?" "He used a secondary charge that was supposed to be a contingency for if the first one failed. Used both. Unnecessarily large. Technically unauthorized." Voss was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to have to pretend to reprimand him for that." "Pretend? He saved 2 ships with it. I'm not actually upset." She took a sip from the metal cup. "I'm going to have to get better at pretending to be upset about things that worked." Outside the window, the rescue ships were moving now, small bright points of light threading through the debris of the Keth swarm, following life pod signals toward the quiet, cold, surviving fragments of the crews that had flown into a consuming biological mass and come back out again. Or most of them, enough of them. Ambassador Previn appeared in the doorway. His color patches were doing something Zyrel had never seen before. A rapid cycling through blues and greens and soft whites that she had to look up later in the diplomatic database and found listed under rare emotional states, category awe with significant prior resistance. He looked at Voss for a long moment. "We were wrong about you," he said finally. "Not about the concerning parts, those are real, but about the rest." Voss glanced at him. "The rest? We thought your stubbornness was irrational," Previn said. "Your refusal to calculate acceptable losses, your insistence on bringing everyone home, we thought it was weakness dressed up as principle." He paused. "It isn't weakness," he said. Voss looked back out the window. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." Zyrel stood between them and looked at the display which now showed, where the Keth swarm had been, the clean and navigable stars of the outer Rin sector and the 4 million human settlements within it and the 31 bait ships limping home, and Colonel Dantier's ridiculous oversized breach point already being marked on navigation charts as a permanent waypoint named, as per Terran military tradition, after whoever made the call. Dantier's Gap it would be called. For the next 300 years, Zyrel looked at all of this and thought about certainty as performance and bravery with choice and the particular kind of species that gives awards to soldiers who get hurt and keep going, and she thought about how the Accord had 1,700 member species and had never called the humans until today. And she thought, with a clarity she had not expected to feel in the aftermath of a battle this close and this costly and this strange, they would not make that mistake again. Not the mistake of calling them, the mistake of waiting so long to do it. She turned to Voss. "The Accord will want to discuss a formal partnership," she said. "A treaty, mutual defense provisions." Voss looked at her for a moment and then she smiled again, and this time it did reach her eyes. "We'll need a bigger table," she said. "Yes," Zyrel agreed. She looked back out the window, at the rescue ships threading through the debris, at the stars that were still standing. "Yes," she said again, quieter, "we will."